Welcome in, everybody, to another deep dive. This time, we're going back to the 1960s in the United States.
A decade that I think, still shapes our world today.
Absolutely. It's a decade that, we could spend hours and hours talking about it, so we're going to try to condense it. We're going to try to condense it into a deep dive, looking at everything from Cold War anxieties to civil rights battles, the counterculture.
It's really a whirlwind of change, right? I mean, we're looking through excerpts from a history textbook called The Unfinished Nation, and it just gives this broad overview of how much happened in such a short period of time.
Yeah, when you think about it, it's like a different world, right? It's a world before the internet, before cell phones.
Even color TV for a lot of folks.
Right, exactly. And a world on the brink of nuclear war, yet bursting with youthful idealism.
Yeah.
Demands for change. It's just a fascinating juxtaposition, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's a time of both great hope and deep uncertainty. Sort of this feeling that the old order is being challenged, but what's going to replace it? What's the future going to look like? And I think that really defines the 1960s in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and we're going to start by looking at the very beginning. The dawn of a new era, the Kennedy presidency. We have this, young, charismatic Senator John F. Kennedy. The youngest person ever elected president and the first Catholic.
This really represents a break from the past, right? This generational shift that promised this fresh perspective, a new approach to governing, and his famous New Generation inaugural address, where he pledged to pay any price, spare any burden for liberty. That really resonated with a lot of Americans, particularly young Americans who saw him as this symbol of hope and progress.
And, like I said, the first Catholic president, that was a big deal at the time.
Absolutely. I mean, he faced significant anti-Catholic sentiment during his campaign. And so that kind of tells you a little something about the social and religious climate of the era, right? His victory, while a sign of changing attitudes, also highlighted these kind of tensions and divisions that still existed within American society.
Yeah, but despite that promise of a new generation, Kennedy's initial focus really was on foreign policy and the Cold War, often overshadowing, at least at first, the growing civil rights movement.
Yeah, I mean, the Cold War was the defining geopolitical conflict of the era, and Kennedy, like his predecessors, was determined to contain the spread of communism globally. He believes that American strength and leadership were essential to preventing what they called the domino effect.
Oh, right.
The idea that if one country fell to communism, others would follow, just like dominoes toppling over. And that fear really drove a lot of U.S. foreign policy.
So he launched a bunch of initiatives, right, like the Peace Corps, the space program, the Alliance for Progress.
Exactly. These were initiatives aimed at projecting American influence, promoting development and democracy around the world. The Peace Corps that sent young Americans to developing countries to provide humanitarian aid, to promote goodwill. The space program, this goal of putting a man on the moon, it was a bold demonstration of American technological prowess and also symbolic in a lot of ways of victory in the space race with the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And then the Alliance for Progress, which was this program of economic aid to Latin American countries. And that really sought to combat poverty and instability, which were seen as breeding grounds for communist influence.
And, I think those initiatives really captured the imagination of the nation and projected this image of American optimism and progress. But there were also some major setbacks. Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 comes to mind.
Yeah, so the Bay of Pigs was this failed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist regime in Cuba. They used a group of Cuban exiles who were trained and supported by the CIA. And Kennedy ultimately pulled back U.S. air support at the last minute, which left those exiles stranded, and most of them were captured.
Wow, that was a disaster for Kennedy and really a major embarrassment for the U.S. on the world stage.
It also really highlighted the complexities and risks of these Cold War interventions, especially in a place like Latin America.
But speaking of Cold War tensions, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962,
this is the one that really gripped the world, right? You have the U.S. and the Soviet Union, these two superpowers with these vast nuclear arsenals, just staring each other down. It was a very scary time for a lot of people.
It all started when U.S. spy planes discovered that the Soviets were secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
Yeah, imagine that. Nuclear missiles that could strike major U.S. cities within minutes. It was a terrifying prospect that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war.
And Kennedy responded by imposing this naval blockade on Cuba, right? to prevent Soviet ships from delivering more missiles. And he also demanded that the Soviets remove the existing missiles.
And Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, denounced the blockade as an act of war and threatened to retaliate. So it's this very tense standoff. Both sides are on high alert. Their nuclear forces are ready to launch. And it really did feel like the world was holding its breath, waiting to see if these two superpowers were going to, push the button and plunge us all into nuclear winter.
But cooler heads prevailed.
Fortunately, yes. After days of intense negotiations, Kennedy and Khrushchev reached a deal. The Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba, and in return, the U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba, and secretly agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey.
It was a close one, wasn't it?
It really was. It was a reminder of just how close the world came to nuclear annihilation.
But it also paved the way for, signing the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, right?
Yeah.
Which banned atmospheric nuclear tests. A small step, but a step nonetheless.
It was a small but significant step towards arms control and reducing that threat of nuclear war.
Meanwhile, back at home,
Right, exactly. While the world is breathing this collective sigh of relief after the Cuban Missile Crisis, another crisis was brewing within the United States, one that would really challenge the nation's conscience and demand a reckoning with its history of racial injustice.
the Civil Rights Movement.
Exactly. While Kennedy is focused on containing communism abroad, you have this new generation of Black activists who are rising up at home, demanding an end to segregation and racial discrimination. Groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE 4, they're organizing sit-ins, boycotts, and freedom rides to challenge Jim Crow laws in the South.
These activists, they faced fierce opposition, often met with violence from white supremacists and police brutality. But their courage and determination really galvanized support for the movement.
One of the most iconic examples is the Freedom Rides, where you have these integrated groups of activists traveling by bus into the Deep South to test the enforcement of federal desegregation laws on interstate transportation. And they faced mob violence, their buses were firebombed, they were arrested and jailed.
It's hard to imagine, going through something like that.
It was a very dangerous and harrowing experience for them, but their actions exposed the brutality of segregation, and it really forced the Kennedy administration to take action.
And then in 1962, a court ordered the University of Mississippi to admit James Meredith, a Black Air Force veteran, as its first Black student. And of course, the state's governor, Ross Barnett, vowed to defy that court order,
He was a staunch segregationist, and he personally blocked Meredith's enrollment.
which led to a violent confrontation. Riots erupted on campus.
Federal marshals clashing with these white mobs. Kennedy was forced to send in federal troops to restore order and ensure Meredith's enrollment.
So the Meredith incident really marked a turning point in Kennedy's approach to civil rights, didn't it?
It did. It forced him to confront the reality of segregation head-on and use the power of the federal government to enforce the law and protect the rights of Black Americans.
Setting the stage for 1963, a pivotal year in the civil rights movement.
That's right. In April of that year, Martin Luther King Jr., the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, and of course a champion of nonviolent resistance, launches this campaign in Birmingham, Alabama. They called it Bombingham because of its history of racial violence.
Yeah.
And Birmingham was a strategic choice. King knew that the city's police commissioner, Bull Connor, who was notoriously racist, would react violently to their protests. And he was right.
Oh, yeah. Connor unleashed attack dogs and high-pressure fire hoses on peaceful demonstrators.
Yeah.
Including children.
And these images were broadcast on national television, and, they horrified the nation and sparked outrage around the world. A real turning point in public opinion as millions of Americans are now witnessing this brutality, the courage of those fighting for equality.
And while jailed in Birmingham for his role in the protests, King penned his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, right?
That's right. It was this powerful call for justice and a rebuke to white moderates who urged patience and condemned the demonstrations.
It's a document that I think still inspires and challenges us today.
Absolutely. But despite the growing momentum of the movement, we still see the forces of hatred and violence very much alive. In September of 1963, a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, a church that served as a meeting place for civil rights activists.
This horrific act of terrorism took the lives of 4 young black girls who were attending Sunday school.
Yeah, it was a devastating blow to the movement and a stark reminder of just how high the stakes were in this fight for equality.
The bombing really shook the nation and galvanized support for the movement.
It underscored the urgency of passing meaningful civil rights legislation and dismantling the system of segregation that bred such hatred and violence.
And just a few months later, in August 1963, over 250,000 people converged on Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
This massive demonstration, a testament to the growing power of the civil rights movement, called for the passage of comprehensive civil rights legislation, an end to discrimination in employment and housing, and a living wage for all workers.
And just a few months later, in August 1963, over 250,000 people converged on Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
This massive demonstration, a testament to the growing power of the civil rights movement, called for the passage of comprehensive civil rights legislation, an end to discrimination in employment and housing, and a living wage for all workers.
And it was at this historic march that Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech.
This masterpiece of oratory that really articulated a vision of a just and equal America.
A nation where his children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
And those words, delivered with such passion and eloquence, really captured the hopes and aspirations of millions.
But tragedy would strike again, just as the movement seemed to be reaching a crescendo. On November 23, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas.
Yeah, the nation mourned the loss of its young president, whose charisma and idealism had really captivated the world. And the circumstances surrounding his death, the alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, his ties to the Soviet Union, and then his subsequent murder by Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner. It just deepened the mystery and fueled these conspiracy theories that persist to this day.
A devastating blow, a sudden end to this era of Camelot.
A nation in shock and grief, grappling with the loss of its leader and the uncertainty of what lay ahead.
And that, of course, brings us to Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy's vice president. A Texan with a reputation for being a shrewd politician.
A master of legislative maneuvering.
And Johnson, he wasted no time in taking charge. He was sworn in as president within hours of Kennedy's assassination, determined to carry forward that torch of progress, especially in the realm of civil rights.
And he believed that enacting Kennedy's vision for a more just and equitable society was the best way to honor his slain predecessor.
He used his political skills and his understanding of the legislative process to push for the passage of that Civil Rights Act that Kennedy had championed.
And in 1964, it became law. This landmark legislation outlawed discrimination based on race, religion, sex, and national origin. In public accommodations, employment, and education, a monumental victory for the civil rights movement.
But the fight for equality was far from over. That same summer, a coalition of civil rights groups launched a massive voter registration drive in Mississippi.
Known as Freedom Summer, and this was a bold attempt to register black voters in a state where they had been systematically denied their voting rights.
And they faced intense opposition, right, from white supremacists, including the Ku Klux Klan.
3 young civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, were murdered by Klansmen. Their bodies were found buried in an earthen dam.
Their deaths shocked the nation and really galvanized support for the movement.
It highlighted the need for federal protection for black voters and the enforcement of voting rights.
And Johnson, responding to this violence, pushed for even stronger voting rights protections.
And in 1965, he signed the Voting Rights Act into law. This landmark legislation outlawed discriminatory voting practices, like literacy tests and poll taxes, and it authorized federal oversight of voter registration in states with a history of discrimination.
A huge victory for the movement, finally guaranteeing the right to vote for Black Americans, a right that had been denied for a century after the Civil War.
The Voting Rights Act, along with the Civil Rights Act, represented a significant step towards fulfilling the promise of equality for all Americans. But as progress is being made on civil rights, the political landscape is shifting. We're seeing this growing divide within the Democratic Party.
The 1964 presidential election really brought those divisions to the forefront.
Absolutely. You have Johnson representing the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, and he faced off against Senator Barry Goldwater, who was considered the father of modern conservatism. Goldwater advocated for smaller government, a more aggressive stance against communism, and criticized what he saw as the excesses of the New Deal welfare state.
And even though his campaign was unsuccessful, it really energized this new conservative movement.
It signaled this shift in Southern voting patterns, with 5 Deep South states voting Republican for the first time since Reconstruction.
Wow.
And that realignment had a profound impact on American politics for decades to come, foreshadowing the rise of the Republican Party in the South and the growing polarization of American politics.
And yet, despite that growing conservative backlash, Johnson continued to push forward with his domestic agenda, known as the Great Society.
Right. This sweeping vision aimed at creating a more just and equitable society by addressing poverty, expanding access to healthcare and education, and promoting opportunity for all Americans. It was, in a lot of ways, a continuation of those progressive ideals of the New Deal. But it went further, tackling issues like racial injustice, environmental protection, and consumer safety.
And he signed into law Medicare and Medicaid. Right?
Correct. He did, providing health insurance to the elderly and the poor. Those programs, despite some initial controversy, have become cornerstones of the American social safety net, providing access to health care for millions of Americans.
And he also launched that war on poverty?
Yes, this multi-pronged effort to address the root causes of poverty through education, job training, and community development programs.
One of the most impactful being, of course, the creation of the food stamp program.
Providing assistance to low-income families to purchase food. This, along with Head Start, which provided early childhood education to disadvantaged children, really aimed to break the cycle of poverty and provide opportunities for upward mobility.
The Great Society faced criticism, of course.
It did. Some criticized its cost, its bureaucracy, and its perceived intrusion into people's lives.
But despite its limitations, I think the Great Society had a lasting impact.
It did. It expanded the role of government in addressing social problems, created a safety net for the most vulnerable, and reflected the optimism of the era that government could be this force for good, and that a more just and equitable society was within reach. We're looking closely at The Unfinished Nation, Chapter 28, Part 2.
Which gets into how the Vietnam War, the rise of Black Power.
All those counterculture movements, it was like the whole country was on fast forward.
Ready to try and make sense of it all.
Absolutely. One thing that jumps out right away is how Vietnam wasn't just this far-off war.
Yeah, it felt very connected to what was going on at home.
It became this, lightning rod for all these tensions that were already simmering in America.
Especially for the Black community and the New Left.
Exactly. They saw Vietnam as a symptom of something much deeper.
Like, wrong with the whole system, not just a policy disagreement.
And you can't forget the Cold War context either.
Oh, right. That whole us versus them mentality was huge.
For Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, they were under immense pressure.
Not to look weak on communism.
Exactly. The domino theory was taken very seriously back then.
That if one country fell to communism, the rest would follow.
Like a chain reaction, and they were terrified of that.
So Vietnam became this test case for American power.
In a way, yes. They felt trapped, like pulling out would embolden the communists everywhere.
And make the U.S. look weak on the world stage.
Precisely. It was a high-stakes geopolitical game, and as a result,
We got sucked deeper and deeper into Vietnam.
the U.S. involvement just kept escalating.
The book actually uses this term, mission creep.
Oh, that's a good word.
Can you explain what that means exactly?
Sure. Mission creep is when you start with a limited goal.
A small military action, say.
Right, and then it gradually expands, almost without you realizing it.
Like you're wading into a pool and suddenly you're in over your head.
Perfect analogy. In Vietnam, it began with just a few advisors.
Supporting the South Vietnamese government.
Right, but within a few years, boom, it was a full-blown war.
With over 500,000 American troops deployed.
500,000. Staggering, isn't it? And speaking of escalation...
Lyndon Johnson really played a key role there.
Oh, absolutely. He was a driving force behind the war.
And the Gulf of Tonkin incident seems like a key moment.
It was. August 1964, there were these supposed attacks on U.S. Navy ships.
In the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam.
Yeah, the details were, and still are, murky.
But Johnson used it to justify a much more aggressive approach.
Exactly. He went to Congress and pushed through the Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
Which gave him broad authority to escalate the war, basically.
A blank check, almost, without a formal declaration of war.
Which, of course, fueled the anti-war movement back home.
Right. And what's fascinating about that movement
is that it wasn't just about Vietnam itself.
It became this umbrella for all sorts of grievances
People had with American society in general.
Absolutely. It brought together college students, civil rights activists.
Everyday people who felt like the government wasn't listening.
It was a really diverse coalition.
Our source material even points out how people had different reasons for opposing the war.
Some were against war in principle, pacifists,
Others were worried about the draft.
especially how unfair it was. College students got exemptions.
So it was working class and poor kids getting sent to fight.
It fueled a lot of resentment, for sure.
Like there were two wars going on, one in Vietnam and one over the war itself here in America.
A great way to put it. And groups like Students for a Democratic Society, SDS,
They were really at the forefront of that domestic battle.
they were one of the first to organize those massive anti-war demonstrations.
Like the March on Washington in April 1965.
And as the war dragged on and the casualties mounted,
The protests got even bigger and sometimes more radical.
people burning their draft cards, fleeing to Canada,
It really shows how strongly people felt.
they were willing to risk everything to make their voices heard.
It was a truly turbulent time.
No doubt about it. And we're just getting started.
Feels like we've barely scratched the surface of everything happening back then.
Oh, yeah. The 60s were a whirlwind of change.
We got Vietnam raging, protests erupting, and at the same time,
This huge push for racial justice.
absolutely can't forget about that.
And while the anti-war movement and the struggle for racial equality were definitely connected,
They weren't the same thing.
it's important to understand the unique dynamics within the Black community.
Right, like figures like Malcolm X, he kind of challenges the usual narrative about the civil rights movement,
Yeah, Malcolm X is such a powerful figure.
calling for Black empowerment, but in a way that was different from Martin Luther King Jr.
Exactly. Malcolm X, he converted to the Nation of Islam while in prison.
I didn't know that.
And initially, he actually advocated for Black separatism.
Really? So not integration.
No, he believed that white society was inherently racist.
So integration was just asking Black people to join a system that was rigged against them.
That's how he saw it.
So instead of working within the system, he wanted to create something totally separate.
Right. He believed Black people needed to build their own institutions, control their own communities.
Define their own destinies, apart from white society.
Exactly. It was a radical idea, for sure.
But it clearly resonated with a lot of Black Americans.
Especially those who were frustrated with the slow pace of change.
Totally. It makes sense why they'd be looking for a different path.
And you can see how Malcolm X's ideas influenced the rise of the Black Power movement.
Which also emphasized self-reliance and Black pride.
Absolutely. Black Power was about rejecting the need for validation from white society.
It was about embracing Black culture and identity on their own terms.
You even see it in the language of the time.
The shift from Negro to Afro-American or Black,
It was about reclaiming their own narrative.
defining themselves, not letting others define them.
And demanding respect, not just asking for it.
And the Black Panther Party, they really embodied this more militant side of Black power, right?
They did. The Panthers are such a striking image of the era.
Honestly, I don't know much about them besides the visuals.
Well, they were fascinating because they combined Black nationalism with Marxist-Leninist ideology.
Okay, gotta admit, I'm not totally clear on what Marxist-Leninist means.
It means they saw the fight for racial justice as part of a bigger class struggle.
Against economic inequality and oppression, basically.
Right. They saw themselves as part of a global movement for socialist revolution.
So that they were fighting on multiple fronts then.
Against racism, against capitalism, against the Vietnam War.
They saw all these issues as interconnected.
Exactly. They wanted a total transformation of American society, not just small reforms.
And they weren't afraid to use militant tactics.
Like armed patrols in Black neighborhoods, monitoring police activity.
They even ran social programs, right? There's a free breakfast programs for kids.
That's right. They combined revolutionary ideology with community service.
It's interesting how they blended those two things.
And all this was happening against the backdrop of what our source material calls ghetto uprisings.
A stark reminder that even after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act,
Yeah, those were huge legal victories.
they didn't erase the deep inequalities that Black Americans still face.
Exactly. Legal rights on paper didn't translate to real equality on the ground.
Discrimination in housing, jobs, education.
And especially within the criminal justice system.
So all that simmering frustration and anger.
It boiled over into violence in several cities.
The Watts riots in 1965, that was a major turning point, right?
Absolutely. 6 days of intense unrest in LA.
Sparked by an incident of police brutality.
It was a brutal illustration of those racial tensions.
Over 30 people were killed.
Hundreds injured, millions of dollars in property damage.
And this wasn't just an isolated incident.
Sadly, no. Similar uprisings happened in Detroit, Newark, Cleveland.
All in the years after Watts.
It became clear that the fight for racial justice was far from over.
Even Martin Luther King Jr., who was known for his commitment to nonviolence
He started talking more about the economic roots of racial inequality,
in the later years of his life.
realizing that true equality wasn't just about legal rights.
It was about economic opportunity as well.
He called for a redistribution of wealth.
A more just economic system that would benefit everyone, not just a select few.
And then, of course, 1968 happened.
1968, what a year.
It felt like the whole world was upside down.
The Tet Offensive in Vietnam, the assassinations of MLK and Robert Kennedy.
The chaos at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
It was a turning point for sure, but in what direction?
Yeah, it's hard to say. The Tet Offensive, while a military defeat for the Viet Cong,
It was a huge psychological blow to the U.S.
it shattered the idea that we were winning the war.
and made people question the government's narrative.
Then, those assassinations, MLK and RFK,
They represented hope for a better future.
their deaths unleashed this wave of grief and anger.
It fueled the unrest that was already gripping the nation.
And then Chicago, the Democratic Convention,
It was supposed to be a moment of unity for the party.
but it descended into chaos.
Anti-war protesters clashing with police.
Images of brutality, the breakdown of
It
order.
was all broadcast on live TV.
It felt like America was coming apart at the seams.
And into this chaos steps Richard Nixon,
Promising law and order.
appealing to the silent majority.
Those who felt left behind by all the upheaval of the 60s.
His victory in the 1968 election really shows how deeply those events had shaken the country,
People were scared, they wanted stability.
even if it meant rolling back some of the progress that had been made.
And there was another group that felt similarly alienated. The New Left.
Our book talks about the old left focusing on labor unions and economic issues.
And the New Left that emerged in the 60s.
What was the difference?
The New Left was mostly young, white, middle-class college students.
They were disillusioned with liberalism
They rejected the top-down approach of the old left.
and embraced a more participatory, grassroots kind of activism.
They were inspired by the civil rights movement.
But they also criticized its focus on legal equality,
They wanted something more radical, more transformative.
a fundamental change in American society.
They were critical of the Vietnam War, of capitalism, of traditional power structures.
So their tactics were different too, right?
Absolutely. They were more confrontational, more direct action-oriented.
Sit-ins, teach-ins, protests. They believed in disrupting the status quo, challenging authority head-on.
Groups like SDS, Students for a Democratic Society,
They were a prime example of this new left approach.
they criticized everything, from the war to corporate power to universities.
One of their early victories was the free speech movement at UC Berkeley.
Oh yeah, 1964.
The administration tried to restrict student political activities,
It sparked huge protests.
led by students like Mario Savio with his famous "Put your bodies upon the gears" speech.
The free speech movement was a turning point for student activism.
But the new left wasn't the only countercultural force at play.
You also had the hippies, the whole peace and love vibe.
It was more than just a fashion or music trend, though, right?
Right, it was a rejection of mainstream values of materialism, conformity, militarism.
They embraced alternative lifestyles, communal living, a more spiritual way of being.
I always think of the yippies, the Youth International Party.
Oh yeah, the pranksters of the counterculture.
They love to use humor and satire to disrupt the system.
Like nominating a pig for president in 1968.
Classic yippies.
They were always pushing boundaries,
And then you had places like Greenwich Village and Haight-Ashbury.
becoming hubs for the counterculture.
Magnets for artists, musicians, writers, anyone who felt like an outsider.
It was all about experimentation and self-expression.
And let's not forget about the sexual revolution.
Oh yeah, the birth control pill changed everything.
Giving women control over their bodies and their choices.
It fueled the idea of free love.
And challenged traditional ideas about sex and relationships.
It was a huge factor in the rise of the feminist movement,
Speaking of which, the 60s saw the emergence of second-wave feminism.
building on the first wave, which focused on suffrage.
Right? The right to vote.
But second-wave feminism had a broader agenda.
It was about challenging patriarchy and demanding equality in all areas of life.
And Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, that was a big catalyst, right?
Huge. It came out in 1963.
It gave voice to the frustrations of so many women.
Who felt trapped in those traditional roles of wife and mother.
Friedan called it the problem that has no name.
That feeling of emptiness and unfulfillment.
Her book sparked a national conversation about women's roles in society.
And it led to the founding of NW.
The National Organization for Women, in 1966.
NW was all about achieving legal equality for women.
In employment, education, politics.
They fought for equal pay, access to childcare, an end to discrimination.
Real concrete changes in policy and law.
But there was also a more radical wing of the movement.
The women's liberation movement.
They were more confrontational, influenced by the tactics of the Black Power and anti-war movements.
They rejected traditional femininity, challenged patriarchal structures, saying that the personal is political.
Like that protest at the 1968 Miss America pageant.
Where they threw bras and high heels into a freedom trash can.
They were rejecting the objectification of women's bodies.
Saying, hey, we're more than just pretty faces.
They wanted to be taken seriously as human beings with their own minds and desires.
And reproductive rights were a central demand.
Absolutely. The right to control their own fertility, access to safe abortion.
It was about bodily autonomy and self-determination.
And alongside all this, you have the gay rights movement starting to gain momentum.
Though they faced even greater challenges with all the stigma and discrimination back then.
Homosexuality was seen as a mental illness, a sin, a crime.
It was illegal in most states.
Gays and lesbians faced discrimination everywhere.
They were harassed by police, forced to live in secrecy.
Just being openly gay was an act of defiance in itself.
And then came the Stonewall riots in 1969.
Oh, Stonewall was a turning point.
The Stonewall Inn, a gay bar in Greenwich Village, got raided by police.
As was common practice.
But this time, the patrons fought back.
They resisted arrest, and it sparked days of riots and protests.
It was a spontaneous uprising against police brutality.
And the birth of the modern gay rights movement.
Stonewall brought the issue of gay oppression into the national spotlight.
It's incredible how much happened in just one decade.
Vietnam, Black Power, the counterculture, the fight for women's rights, gay rights.
The 60s transformed America in profound ways.
It was a time of progress and backlash, idealism and disillusionment.
Our book says the 60s didn't lead to a full-blown revolution.
But they revolutionized American life.
And that's a question worth pondering as we try to understand our own time.
It's a question without an easy answer, but an important one nonetheless.
Did the 60s ultimately lead to lasting positive change, or did they plant the seeds for the division and polarization we see today?
We may not have the answer, but it's a question we should all be asking ourselves. Well, thanks for joining us as we explored this pivotal era in American history.
It's been a pleasure.
And as always, we encourage you to keep digging deeper, keep questioning, keep the conversation going.